All right, g'day everyone. Thank you for joining me on not just any other week of readings for our Chronological Bible Reading Plan, but the very last week of Old Testament readings. Congratulations. We will be this week finishing off the Hebrew Bible, okay? It's week number 39, which is really an interesting coincidence, I think, because next week when we start the New Testament, it'll be week 40. And of course, as we know from reading the Old Testament, 40 is a significant number which speaks of a whole new generation. So I promise you, I did not plan it that way. It just came out like that in the schedule. I think that's really, really interesting. All right, last week we basically read about the first 20 years of post-exile history for Israel, okay, or post-exilic history. As we kicked off the book of Ezra, we saw the rebuilding of the temple, the restoration of worship in the promised land, thanks to prophetic encouragement from Haggai and Zechariah, two prophets, and thanks to political encouragement from two of the kings of Persia. Babylon now is taken out of the picture. They've been conquered by Persia. In fact, they've been conquered by Persia and the Medes. Remember, Daniel said that, or Isaiah might have been as well, that said that Persia and the Medes would unite and form this great force that would take out Babylon. Well, effectively that happened. Persia overcame the people of Media and basically absorbed their armies, okay, and became the world-dominating force at this part in history. Well, part of what the kings did is they wanted to send all the Babylonian captives back to their lands, not just Israel, history tells us, but other people as well, back to their lands to worship their gods in their local place. And I think this is the Persians' way of making sure that, they keep all the neighboring gods happy with them. So that's what's happening. It happened to Israel as well. Anyway, that's what happened. They're there for 20 years. They rebuild the temple. And as we saw, though, and as we mentioned, as good as that sounds, it's not that glorious. One thing that happens, or one thing that doesn't happen when they finish the temple, is God's glory doesn't come. Like it did with Moses in the sanctuary, like it did with David and Solomon's temple. The glory of God has not descended upon the temple, and so it's a bit of an anticlimax when you consider all the wonderful prophetic promises that were meant to come to pass. When are these prophetic promises going to come? Is this really the time of the restoration of all things? Well, we'll just wait and see. This week we are finishing off the Old Testament. As I said, we're going to finish Ezra and Nehemiah. We're going to read our final Psalm, Psalm 126, our final prophet, Malachi, and also the little book of Esther, which is a great read. And then congratulations, that's it. You have read the Old Testament. Christmas is coming. All right, so with that in mind, I want to talk to you on this video as you read the readings this week about the 4 days of Christmas. All right, 4 things I want you to pay attention to as you do your readings this week and finish off the Old Testament. Where are we? There we go. Okay, 4 things. 4 Persian kings, 3 waves of return, 2 Hebrew heroes, and 1 day of the Lord. Okay, here we go. Firstly, I want you to pay attention to 4 Persian kings. In the scriptures that we're reading cover a period of about 100, maybe 120 years, and there are 4 Persian kings in charge at that time. Cyrus, who overtook Babylon, he's the first guy. Darius, who rules for a while, probably the guy that put Daniel in the lion's den. Between the two of them, these are the guys that helped rebuild the temple. The next guy is a guy called Xerxes, which features in the book of Esther. So he is king number 3. And incidentally, he also, history shows us, invaded Greece on a number of military campaigns, even at one time successfully taking over Athens and holding on to Athens. So the Persians and the Greeks did not have a very good relationship, and this would not bode well for Persia after 200 years when Alexander the Great would rise up in Greece and basically wipe out Persia as foretold by prophecy, all right? So that's just an interesting bit of history. And then the 4th Persian king is Artaxerxes, and he is significant for our story because he is the one that sends back to Judah Ezra and Nehemiah, all right? 4 Persian kings. That's the first thing I want you to notice. The next thing I want you to notice is 3 waves of return. Zerubbabel, we've already read, and then Ezra and Nehemiah. God's people return in this period of history to Judah, to Jerusalem, in 3 waves, which is really interesting because, as you remember, in Babylon's day, they were taken away from Israel, or from Judah, in 3 separate waves. Do you remember that? When Nebuchadnezzar's in charge, Daniel's in the first wave, Ezekiel's in the second, Jeremiah's there for the third and the final destruction. People are taken away in 3 waves. Well, now they are restored back in 3 separate waves, noted by Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. And each wave of return has a different emphasis of restoration. Under the first, they restored worship. Under the second, they restore the word. And under the third, Nehemiah restores the walls. All right, so keep a note of that. Worship, the word with Ezra, a lot of scripture reading, returning, pledging themselves to obey the Torah, the word, and thirdly, the rebuilding of the walls. So that's an interesting thing. And in fact, it made me remember this week, I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but it made me think about Peter denying Jesus 3 times in the Gospels, but then being restored back to Jesus 3 times when Jesus said, "Feed my lambs, feed my lambs, feed my lambs." Interesting. Anyway, maybe I'm reading too much into that. I'll leave that with you. All right, 4 Persian kings, 3 waves of return, 2 Hebrew heroes. This week you're going to be reading the story of Esther. It's a great book. It reads just like a novel. Okay, great thing to read the kids at bedtime. And in that story there are 2 heroes, Mordecai and Esther. And of course, with every hero needs a villain. The villain in this case is a guy called Haman, who's basically a Nazi. Okay, he wants to have a holocaust of all the Jewish people in the kingdom of Persia, but it doesn't work out well for him. God is working behind the scenes and protecting his people. That's an interesting thing. I say deliberately God is working behind the scenes, because one of the interesting things about Esther is that God is not mentioned in the story. Okay, take note. There's no mention of God, no mention of prayer, no mention of worship, no mention of sacrifices or religion or anything to do with Israel's covenant story. It talks about God's people, the Jews now. We're going to see that term over and over again. The word Jew is really emerging in this part of history because it means men of Judah, basically. Okay, but it talks about them really in a secular term. But whatever the reason for that is, here's the outcome of the story. The outcome of the story is, or the point of the story is to show that even when God's people are under his judgment because of Moses' covenant, okay, he is still protecting them because of Abraham's covenant. They are still Abraham's descendants, and God said to Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you." So God is still, in a sense, with his people, even though they are scattered throughout Persia. And the end of the story results in a Jewish festival called Purim, okay, which is not a festival that God instructed them to do, like tabernacles and Passover and the rest of it, but it's a Jewish festival that they decided to commemorate this story of Mordecai and Esther. So I don't want to spoil the end for you, but that's basically where it ends up. These are 2 very important Hebrew heroes in this time of history. You're going to enjoy that story, okay? So there you go, 4 days of Christmas. Oh, we got one more. 4 Persian kings, 3 waves of return, 2 Hebrew heroes, and the 1 more day of the Lord. Oh my goodness. And this comes courtesy of the prophet Malachi, who basically just echoes what Daniel told us and what I think Isaiah said from memory, certainly Zechariah last week, where they look beyond this era of post-exile restoration and they look into the future for God's people and see yet another day of devastation and disaster and destruction coming their way. Yet another day of the Lord is coming at some point in the future of God's people. Malachi tells us that this will be a day where the wicked will be destroyed with fire, and destroyed so that not only are their branches burned up, but they are destroyed right down to the root, which kind of indicates there's no hope of regrowth coming from them. This sounds pretty serious. But the righteous among them will flee like calves released from the stall. They will be declared God's treasured possession, which is Exodus language. So it's basically telling us another Exodus will take place at some point in the future. And the sign that this is about to happen. When will this happen? When will this day of the Lord come? Well, the sign that this will happen will be that God will send Elijah, the prophet, once more. Elijah will return before this great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. And so there it is. 4 Persian kings, 3 waves of return, 2 Hebrew heroes, but 1 more, unfortunately, promised day of the Lord, which basically means that the Old Testament ends with a real ominous feeling about it, you know? God's people are in the promised land. They've got political support. Generally, you know, the temple is rebuilt. They're doing okay, but God's glory isn't there. They don't have a king on the throne. They've been given a new start, but they don't have a new heart, as the prophets promised. They don't have a new covenant yet, like the prophets promised. And remember, they were told they'll have a new covenant with a new heart. And they don't have a new Jerusalem that is protected and peaceful from the enemies around it, because yet again, another day of the Lord is on its way. So the Old Testament does end with this kind of ominous feeling, and you get the sense that, gee, I wonder if these people have not learnt their lesson. Will history repeat itself? Have these people not learnt the lesson of all the other devastations that have taken place? When will this curse of the law, the bondage of Moses' covenant, where God will curse them if they disobey, when will that end? When will a new covenant be given to them and the restoration of all things take place? Well, I can't tell you yet, but we know it's coming at some point. All right, guys, enjoy it. Congratulations, you've finished the Old Testament. Keep your eye out for those 4 things this week. 4 Persian Kings, 3 waves of return, 2 Hebrew heroes, and another day of the Lord. And next week, we'll celebrate Christmas in Matthew chapter 1. Congratulations. Thank you for joining me yet again. And I'll see you next month for a whole new week and a whole new generation of readings. Bless you lots. Bye.